This video is part of Operation Clashing Creeds, a collaboration of several different history YouTubers concerning religious warfare and tension in early modern Europe. Please check the link in the description for more details.
The Protestant Reformation, which began with the nailing of the 95 Theses in 1517, having had precedent with an overlooked forefathers, was undoubtedly one of the most significant events ever. Void as such, the world could and never would have been the same, her consequence manifold. But for the Reformation to survive, contrary to the prior destruction of Hus, the persecution of the Waldensian, or the anathema Wycliffe received after death, the Reformation needed her followers, her heroes, and yes, her champions. Thusly explains the title, The Champions of the Reformation. As Luther departed the Diet of Worms after holding firm to the faith, with no recantation nor cowardice, he gave himself a sentence of certain death by being given an imperial ban, and his clemency was almost spent. But then a group of horsemen galloped nigh and kidnapped Luther. This would have seemed to be the end of the great reformer, but these men were acting in kind and upon the order of Fredrick III, the Elector of Saxony. Luther would then be taken to Wartburg Castle under the alias of Junker Georg, and sojourn there for about a year, where Luther would prevail and continue his sacred work, most famously translating the Bible into German, the language of the people. Without this act of grace, who knows what it could have been? Although the Elector was a lifelong Roman Catholic, there's a chance he converted to Lutheranism on his deathbed, as he took such a communion. His brother John, Elector of Saxony, succeeded him, and would then establish the Church of Saxony in 1527. Therefore, our first champion of the Reformation is Fredrick III, the Elector of Saxony, the Wise. Following a study of the sacred scriptures and of the Church Fathers, Phillp I, the Landgrave of Hesse, converted to Lutheranism in the year 1524, bringing to the service of his new cause a will of steel. Firstly, he would initiate the Marburg Colloquy, which saw the discussion betwixt the reformers Martin Luther and Ulrich Zwingli, wherein they saw a plurality of agreement on doctrinal questions, but the topic of the Lord's Supper arose, and the dispute on such was too grave. A year later, in 1530, the Diet of Augsburg would see an imperial ordinance jeopardize the Lutheran princes. Philip would in response, along with other Lutheran princes, establish the Schmalmadic League, united to protect one another. However, during this time, by the Lord's grace, the Ottoman Empire caused many woes for the Habsburgs, and they needed help. The Landgrave would offer such, but on the condition that the Augsburg clauses be undone, and to much honor for Philip, that would be done, granted within the Peace of Nuremberg. For the coming years, the Landgrave would continue to hold colloquies between various theologians. But in 1540, the Landgrave would commit bigamy and marry Margaret von Dessau, very much against the empire's imperial law. Charles V now saw it fit to take up arms to create unity within his empire, and that manifested within the Schmalmadic War of 1546 to 1547, which saw the triumph of the Catholics against the ill-organized League, and the Landgrave would then be taken captive. Charles V would pronounce the Augsburg Interim, which very much abated the Protestant right. Philip would be released from captivity with the Treaty of Passau in 1552, and 3 years later, Philip's achievement of crowning glory would materialize, the Peace of Augsburg of 1555, which gave Lutheran princes the right to choose the realm's faith freely. Therefore, Philip I, the Landgrave of Hesse, is a champion of the Reformation, and it was quoted that he has done more for Protestantism than 100 of Luther's books. The sacred flame of the Reformation had spread to France, and many souls were converted to the Huguenot faith, and as tensions grew betwixt the two sides, a dreadful series of wars would manifest, known as the French Wars of Religion. Following the failures of the 1561 Colloquy of Poissy and the 1562 Massacre of Roissy, the Lord of Châtillon, Gaspard II de Coligny, would rise to the challenge and lead the Huguenots into war. Now Gaspard had converted to Protestantism whilst languishing in captivity, and he even made correspondence with John Calvin himself in around the year 1558. At the outbreak of the First War of Religion, Gaspard would take up his arms and head the Protestant cavalry. However, the First War of Religion would come to a close in 1563 by the Edict of Amboise, and a period of peace would then abide. But then the Second War of Religion would break out in 1567, and Gaspard would then again have to make war until the 1568 Treaty of Langevin. The persecution of the Huguenots persisted, however, and again the Protestants would raise their arms in the Third War of Religion later that same year. Gaspard's ally, Louis I of Condé, would die in the calamitous Battle of Jarnac in 1569, and Gaspard would then be the sole leader of the Huguenots. Even after the dire Battle of Montancourt in the October of 1569, Gaspard remained ardent and would even advance near Paris, thereby forcing the 1570 Peace of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, a great triumph for the Protestants. Lord Gaspard would return to the good graces of the French court and King Charles IX, where he continued to champion the Protestant cause. On the 22nd of August 1572, an attempt on Gaspard's life proved vain, and King Charles IX came to visit him. A day later, on the 23rd, St. Matthew's Day, Gaspard, along with other Huguenots, would die, being butchered on the order of the very same king who had paid him a visit a day previous. The Protestants mourn his death, whereas the Papists rejoice. The Protestants in France would thereafter eventually be erased. Therefore, Lord Gaspard II de Coligny is a champion of the Reformation. And it was said by his assassin, Gesmi, "I never saw a man meet death more valiantly than the Admiral."
The cherished son of the renowned King Henri VIII was coronated at the age of 9 years on the 20th of February 1547, and within his tragically short reign he would defend and champion the Anglican faith. The Book of Common Prayer was begotten, services would be conducted in English, and further Catholic practices would be abandoned. However, at the age of 15, Edward would grow ill, and whilst languishing, he would attempt to ensue a Protestant succession, before the everlasting sting of death took Edward to the grave. In faith he cried, "Lord God, deliver me out of this miserable and wretched life, and take me among thy chosen. Howbeit not my will, but thy will be done. Lord, I commit my spirit to thee. O Lord, thou knowest how happy it were for me to be with thee, yet, for thy chosen sake, send me life and health, that I may truly serve thee. O Lord God, bless thy people, and save thine inheritance. O Lord God, save thy people of England. O my Lord God, defend this realm from papistry, and maintain thy true religion, that I and my people may praise thy holy name, for the Son of Jesus Christ's sake. I am faint, Lord, have mercy upon me, and take my spirit." His attempt to prevent the Papist reclamation of the throne would prove vain, with the deposition of the Protestant Lady Jane Grey by the infamous Mary I, who would take vengeance for Rome, punishing the reformers. Therefore, Edward VI, by grace of God, King of England, France, and Ireland, defender of the faith, and on earth under Jesus supreme head of the churches of England and Ireland, was a champion of the Reformation. And it is no doubt shocking Edward is excluded in John Foxe's ever-great book of Martyrs as a blessed king.
The pitiful War of 30 Years ravaged the continent of Europe. Death, woe, and destruction followed her every step. But for the Protestants, a champion would arise and defend the faith. This was to be King Augustus II, Adolfus of Sweden. Gustavus would inherit the throne at the age of 16 in 1611, resolving the calamities he inherited from his father Charles IX. His wars against Poland would be that of defending the Protestant faith from the Catholic king Sigismund III Vasa, who possessed a credible claim to the Swedish throne. If the Catholics took out Scandinavia and northern Germany, the flame of the Reformation would be dimmed. That is why he and an army of 15,000 gallant men went to go and fight that Papist Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand II in 1630. In this endeavor, Gustavus won much acclaim. His triumph at Bratenfield in 1631 saw the first major Protestant victory in the war. It was followed by the Battle of Rain in 1632, killing the great Catholic commander, the Count of Tilly. But on the 16th of November, 1632, the so-called Lion of the North would fall on the earth of Lutzen. The Protestants then lost the greatest general, and the advance into Bavaria was halted. Therefore, the great King of Sweden, general and man, King Augustus II Adolphus of Sweden, was and is the last champion of the Reformation. Now these 5 men, a lord, a landgrave, an elector, and 2 kings, made their stand and defended the Protestant faith. If it weren't for their gallant actions, perhaps the world would be even more enslaved, snared by Rome's chains. They may have not been reformers in the theological sense. However, they let Christ reform their hearts, and willed that Christ would reform the domains and subjects' hearts anew. Therefore, these were the champions of the Reformation.
At a great cost, over 400 years ago, the martyrs and reformers and confessors broke the shackles of popish superstition and priestcraft and recovered the gospel in what is known in history as the Great Reformation. I am a Reformation Protestant.